Mr. President, the cabinet confirmation process is well underway here in the United States Senate. Confirmation hearings began this week with Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth and the Armed Services Committee on Tuesday. Yesterday, we had 6 confirmation hearings, the most confirmation hearings, I might add, in a single day since 2001. And we have more happening today and tomorrow. By the time President Trump takes the oath of office on Monday, the Senate will have held hearings for 12 of his nominees. And there are plenty more to come. Once the committees, I should say, complete their work, the process will move to the floor. We will move as quickly as possible on those votes. And I hope Democrats will provide a level of cooperation that will allow us to quickly fill these positions so that nominees begin their work for the American people. Mr. President, one of the nominees being considered this week is a familiar face to us in the Senate. Yesterday, our longtime colleague, Senator Rubio, found himself on the other side of the dais at the Foreign Relations Committee for his hearing to be Secretary of State. Members of that committee are well acquainted with Senator Rubio's expertise in foreign policy. He's been a leading voice on those issues here in the Senate and on the Foreign Relations Committee since he arrived here in 2011. And yesterday, his expertise was on full display. Whether he was discussing China, the Middle East, Russia, our alliances, or anything else, our colleague demonstrated his command of international affairs. Marco also clearly laid out the philosophy he will bring to the job. He spoke about peace through strength, restoring American leadership, and advancing America's interests. Mr. President, our colleague is ready to step into the leadership void that the Biden administration has too often left on the world stage. In too many instances, the Biden administration has chosen to appease our enemies rather than demonstrate strength. He's yesterday made clear we can expect Senator Rubio to bring a moral clarity to foreign policy that has been sorely lacking in the last 4 years. That's important, Mr. President. Moral clarity, and has never been a challenge for Marco Rubio. Take our relationship with China. The senior senator from Florida has been a leading voice on the Chinese Communist Party's malign intentions and their implications for the United States. He has been clear-eyed about what the United States ought to do to outcompete China in this century. And he's been outspoken in calling attention to China's human rights abuses. He was a leading voice on China's repression of its own people in Xinjiang. And he led the charge on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States Senate. And he didn't stop once it became law. He made sure the legislation was being implemented properly. He called out companies suspected of using forced labor. And he advocated for the Biden administration to do a better job of vetting imports. Mr. President, all of us here in the Senate know Marco's unwavering commitment to freedom. He's been a strong supporter of freedom fighters in Hong Kong, and he's been outspoken in his support for Taiwan as the Chinese Communist Party has grown more aggressive. He's also a fierce defender of democracy and human rights in Latin America. His family watched their native Cuba deteriorate under a communist dictatorship, and it was conversations with his grandfather about Cuba's plight that drew Senator Rubio into public service. So it's no surprise he's one of the strongest defenders of the rights of the Cuban people. He's also a strong voice for democracy and justice in Venezuela. Marco's been outspoken in his criticism of the Biden administration's appeasement of the Maduro regime. And he was a clear voice in defense of democracy as the country suffered through Maduro's corrupt election last year. Mr. President, as we heard in his testimony yesterday, our colleague is focused on advancing America's interests. As he said, and I quote, "Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, and every policy we pursue must be justified by the answer to 3 simple questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Or does it make America more prosperous?" End quote. Mr. President, I think that's what the American people should expect from a Secretary of State and from their government. And anybody who watched his hearing yesterday knows that's what we're going to get from Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. I'll have more to say about Marco and other nominees for the Trump administration as they move through the process here in the United States Senate, and I look forward to hearing from each of the President's nominees in the near future. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.